So good evening, everybody. My name is Mike Oldham. I'm the Wildlife Refuge Manager at Quivira National Wildlife Refuge. And although I heard that we were able to have some sort of a presentation or program in person, I guess we'll go ahead and share through a virtual venue, and we'll just take what the circumstances give. So anyway, what I'm here today is as part of the crane celebration for Audubon, Kansas. I'd like to go ahead and present a little bit about what Quivira National Wildlife Refuge is, and really stay at a kind of a high level whenever I talk about what the refuge has and all the different programs and stuff like that. And so as the other presenters give their programs over the next day or two, I think what you're going to hear is you're going to hear a lot more in-depth information, maybe not only about water management, about other species and whooping cranes in general. So that's why I'm keeping mine pretty broad. So we will go ahead and get going here, and got about 18 or 19 slides we'll share with you and really talk about the refuge and what we have to offer. All right, gotta make sure our IT stuff works and PowerPoint works. So the biggest thing right now that I would offer up, and this is what I try to share with any audience, there's probably a lot of folks out there who've been on the refuge before, some that are very intimately connected and know about it, but others who are pretty well new to not only Quivira Refuge, but maybe even the National Wildlife Refuge system. So I like to let everybody know up front that basically Quivira is federally managed by the National Wildlife Refuge system and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So as we go into the program, I'll share it. I've got a map on the next slide, but Quivira is it's part of a larger system that really encompasses about 560 national wildlife refuges. And in fact, we're about 568 right now as of 2020. And so we're under the Department of Interior, and that would be the same department as you would find the National Park Service or Bureau of Land Management or one of the other federal agencies. And so oftentimes, and I've got it down there, oftentimes we're confused with being a national park or a national preserve or even a state managed wildlife area. So just wanted to let you know that we are a national wildlife refuge. We go a little bit further into it, and I realize the map is fairly small and there's not a whole lot you can see here, but it really goes to show maybe the scope of where the National Wildlife Refuge system lies. And so if you look across the US, you can pretty much find a National Wildlife Refuge or refuges in just about every state across the US. And that also includes Hawaii, Puerto Rico, we've got one in Guam. And what's not depicted here is the state of Alaska. And so across the National Wildlife Refuges, I think we're sitting somewhere around 95 million acres in land under National Wildlife Refuges, and Alaska alone has well over 90 million. And so if you think about the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northern Alaska, that refuge alone is about 19 million and just a little bit over. So pretty expansive out there. So we've got those refuges, and we also have wetland management districts, primarily up in the prairie pothole regions of the US, up near the Canada border. So what does the US Fish and Wildlife Service do? I guess we've got a couple different branches that would be probably better to explain, in that the National Wildlife Refuges is only one part of the US Fish and Wildlife Service. We've also got our Ecological Services branch, which is sort of our regulatory branch that actually talks about and brings into play the endangered species and defining and putting endangered species into play and deciding which ones belong and which ones don't. We've also got other programs like Fisheries and Habitat Conservation, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, which is a fish and wildlife employee that works off refuge property with private landowners to deliver resource conservation on private land. We've got Migratory Birds Program, invasive species, environmental contaminants, and of course, our National Wildlife Refuges. One big thing to always let folks know about, and they always wonder about the activities and public uses and things that happen on a refuge. basically, our first priority is for the conservation of wildlife and wildlife habitat. And so, whereas you think about the National Park Service being primarily there for public and public visitation and recreation, the National Wildlife Refuge System is basically wildlife first. And so you'll see down the left-hand side of the screen there, we've got fishing, hunting, wildlife observation, photography, environmental education, and interpretation. And a number of years ago, those are what they call the Big Six public use priorities, and that they were determined that they could happen on a national wildlife refuge, and a lot of them do. One thing you've got to keep in mind is we have to look at the purpose of the refuge and basically determine whether or not those uses are compatible, not only with the mission of the service, but the purpose of each refuge. And if they don't detract away from the purpose of the mission, then by all means, we can allow fishing, hunting, wildlife observation, and the others as well. So you'll find Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, we've got basically all 6 of those that we can offer, and they really don't have any kind of detraction from our mission or purpose. So a lot of different uses on a National Wildlife Refuge. And drilling down a little closer to home, so the state of Kansas, we've got 4 national wildlife refuges that are out there. Of course, Quivira, which is where I'm located, but we've also got Flint Hills, a little further east of where we're located and east of Wichita. Quivind National Wildlife Refuge is located up around Russell, Kansas, up in the northwestern part of the state. And then Meredith Singh National Wildlife Refuges that's on the eastern border of Kansas. And going down just a little bit further, and this is to talk more specifically about the refuge. It was basically established in May of 1955. And each refuge really is established for a primary purpose. Ours, and in fact, Quivira's was to provide a migratory stop for wintering and migrating waterfowl and water birds in the Central Flyway. And so not only for, feeding and resting, but also nesting during different seasons and stuff like that. So that is basically why Quivira is there. And if you've been on the refuge before, I guess you've probably seen this map either in our visitor center or in our brochure, but kind of walk you through some of the obvious stuff. This is our refuge and the layout of the boundary. And basically the green outline is what we call a refuge boundary. And that really does encompass about 22,135 acres. So it's a pretty big refuge as compared to some. At widest, it's about 3 miles east to west. But from north to south, if you were to start down at the visitor center and then go up to the north, we're about 13 to 14 miles from north to south. So it's expanded over quite a large area in central Kansas. It's located in 3 different counties: Stafford County, Rice County, and Reno County. And so we're in just about a lot of different areas of the state. The refuge habitat is primarily native sand prairie, so I would say it's probably between half and 3/4 of the refuge is native sand prairie, with the other 1/4 to 1/3 being the refuge wetlands. And so, and as I go into my program a little bit, I show a few more views of the wetlands, but we have anywhere between, let's say, 5,000 acres and 7,000 acres of wetlands, depending on how wet a year it is and whether or not we're in flooding conditions or not. So quite a staggering amount of wetlands whenever you look across the refuge. And the wetlands are a little bit unique in that we have not only fresh wetlands, but we also have saltwater wetlands. So at the very south end around Little Salt Marsh and where the visitor center is at, we've got Rattlesnake Creek that flows into Little Salt Marsh. And that basically makes it more of a freshwater wetland. Where if you look up at the north around Big Salt Marsh and Wildlife Drive, that whole area is primarily salty and or brackish. And so there really is a variation when it comes down to the different types of wetlands and what it provides for the birds that migrate through. And another thing about Quivira is that it's got different types of wetlands, permanent, seasonal, and temporary waters, depending on how much rainfall we're getting. But the refuge as a whole, depending on what we're looking at, whether it's wetland restoration or wetland management or anything like that, it requires a lot of management to maintain. And so just a little bit further into my program, I'll talk about each of those a little more specifically. And so I like to always show this one because it really does talk about the uniqueness of the refuge. What makes it so unique, and I think of it in the standpoint of being its geographic location in the US, and what I like to refer to as the bottleneck. So if you think about it, in the middle of the Central Flyway, it's basically a heavy used migration route for all the birds that come down from the north, whether it's Canada, the far northern territories, all the way down through the prairie potholes. Everything basically comes down through the center of the states, right through and across Quivira on their way to areas further south. And so because we're centrally located, not only in the US, east to west and north to south, we get the benefit of seeing a lot of different species that occur, some in the western part of the US, but also some in the east. Case in point, it's a pretty easy one to pick out, would be like the meadowlark. And so if you were to look, we get both western and eastern meadowlark species on the refuge. So it really is kind of neat to see the best of both worlds right in the middle of the US. So. And this diagram shows that bottleneck that I referred to a little bit more specifically. And you can really see all pretty much the northern parts of the state up in Canada and down through the Northwestern Territories, and all that comes right across the middle part of the US, and Quivira is basically outlined where that blue star is. So that's what makes this place as important as it is today. So. The second, the other unique thing that I would say is basically refers to what I was talking about, the water. And the uniqueness making that there's not any other, or that I know of, any other wetlands in the US outside of those along coastal areas that could be called inland salt waters or brackish waters or something like that. So those waters are basically, found in coastal areas, but here we are in the middle of Kansas, and that's what makes us so unique. And we've got an underlying, basically a mineral intrusion zone that lays into the refuge. And when the aquifer and the artesian wells percolate up through the ground, they go through basically that mineral zone and then bring those salts to the surface. And that's basically what accumulates up in areas around the Big Salt Marsh, Wildlife Drive, and the Northern Flats. And so you can see on the picture on the right-hand side where some of that salt accumulates at the surface after you get evaporation and stuff like that occurring. And makes it an absolute great ideal place for plants like saltgrass and alkali saccatone to grow. So really is neat to have that inland salt wetland component to the refuge. And as a result of the ideal location, I mean, not only the location on the Central Flyway, but the water and stuff like that, it really does make for a spectacular place when the birds come migrating through. And I guess I would take this opportunity to not only talk about, the general waterfowl, the geese and the ducks and all that come through, but even this time of year, and basically why this event is being put on. Celebration of cranes is the whooping cranes that come through. And so, we've had about 8 or so that came through the refuge so far in the last week and a half. And in this migration corridor, I think in 2020, we had as many as probably about 505 whooping cranes that would migrate through. And at any one point throughout this fall, we should see about a third of that population of cranes. About a third of that 505 actually come through the refuge, which is outstanding. And this right here is basically, as a bird flies over and as a bird sees it, this is what they see from the air. And it kind of shows you the expanse of our wetlands from north to south. And if you look at the far north edge in the upper left-hand corner, Little Salt Marsh, and then that star. The star is where the visitor center is at. And then we've got Little Salt Marsh, which is one of our larger wetlands. And as you travel north, we've got an expanse of wetlands, about 28 or 29 in all, that go all the way up to the Big Salt Marsh, that make up the wetland complex on Quivira. So like I said, at any one time, we have between 5,000 and 7,000 acres of wetlands. just depending on how much rainfall is out there and whether or not we're in a flooding event. But we like to average out somewhere around 5,500 acres of wetlands every year if we have the option. So, and I guess I need to travel back and get just a little bit into our active programs. Step away from the wetlands just a little bit, but if you think about Quivira Refuge and even some of the other refuges in the National Wildlife Refuge system, a lot of them no longer have the disturbances, whether it's bison running across there and either trampling the ground or eating the vegetation, or an active, fire season, an active fire program going across there, or even the flooding conditions like what had happened prior to man coming on the scene. And so without that disturbance on the landscape, we still try to actively manage the refuge, basically to mimic those disturbances. And so as part of any of our things, and as part of any of our programs on the refuge, we still do a lot of active management, like herbicide control of invasive species, or mowing cattail, or mowing out areas in the wetlands and or the sand prairie. We try to put a lot of fire on the ground to set back succession and kind of keep the trees at bay and stuff like that, so they're not encroaching on the upland prairie areas. And we even go as far as not only using fire, but heavy equipment to control invasive trees that come in. So some refuges, especially up in Alaska and others, are wilderness areas, and they do very little to manage their wild areas, but Quivira is one of them that we have to continue to management, otherwise we'll lose what the value of Quivira is. So always providing some sort of active management. And you'll also see that with our wetlands, where we have wetlands not only strung across the refuge, but we've got canals and ditches, and we elevate the water levels. We bring the water levels down to make the habitat basically what the birds need whenever they show up on the refuge. So there's a lot of flooding and not only flooding, but drying out of the wetlands that helps manage for the birds that migrate through. And I'd already talked about the fire and the fire program. We try to utilize that as many of the other refuges and even some of the state areas in Kansas does as well. And we do have also there in the bottom picture, instead of having bison on the ground, we have a grazing program from May through August where we use cattle. And those cattle kind of act as a program like the bison would have prior to the refuge establishment. So we try to do active management on a lot of different ways in a lot of different programs. So, kind of wrapping this up a little bit, I've kind of hit some of the refuge at a higher level, but I would like to kind of outline 4 designations that are basically, given to the refuge, and it basically demonstrates, the significance of Quivira. And so it is designated as a wetland of international importance by the Ramsar Treaty. It's also part of the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. It's been identified as an important bird area by the American Bird Conservancy, and a globally important bird area by the National Audubon Society. And so if that wasn't enough for you, it's also one of the 8 wonders of Kansas. So it really is a significant refuge when you start looking at it. And I would just follow up by taking this time and saying, the reason that kind of given this program and the reason Audubon of Kansas is really putting this together is celebration of cranes. And I gave a little bit of an update earlier, but as of this year in the fall, so far we've seen about 8 whooping cranes coming through the refuge, and I know there's more on the way. We've got a cold front that's just bearing down on us right now, and so we expect to see probably quite a few more in the days ahead. And so neat to see them out there. Like I said, there's probably about 505 that we think that are in the population. Of course, you'll get more of that with the other presenters as they give their programs, but certainly hope to see a lot of other birds and whooping cranes on the refuge, and hopefully see some of you on the refuge this coming fall as well. So I think I will leave my program at that. I know we're going to have a Q&A session a little bit later on, but why don't I follow up by giving you this following slide, kind of the exit slide. And you can either look us up on our refuge website as shown below, or give us a call at our phone number there at the office. So So we'll go ahead and leave it with that, and I will turn it back over to Audubon of Kansas and let them kind of take it from there. And thank you very much for your time.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike. That was a really good overview of Quivira. I've only been there a couple times, but you surely expanded my information about it as well. I want people to think about this now. If you have any questions, send them to me, and then I will ask your question, and Mike will answer it, hopefully. So I'm going to leave this up for a few seconds so that people can think about what questions they might have and get them sent to me. So what kind of questions you have. In the meantime, though, I would like to also make sure that people you fill out our survey on our Audubon of Kansas website, how you like the program. You can wait till you've watched all of them or however you want to do it. But we would really like your feedback. And also all of the videos of these presentations, there's one tomorrow night, Friday night, and then there's 2 during the day on Saturday. These will be archived and put on our website, and you can go and watch them at any time you want. If you didn't get to see them all, I encourage you to do that. So let me see here. Okay. We're back. I don't see any questions yet. Mike, what are some of your other talks and things, what are some of the most frequently asked questions about Quivira?
You know, I would say, as I alluded to in my program, it's a lot of folks don't really know what either the National Wildlife Refuge System or any refuge in general has to offer. So when they see things like hunting and fishing, you know, they think that a wildlife refuge is basically a preserve, so hands off. But they really don't know that, you know, how can you hunt on a refuge? How can you fish on a refuge? So a lot of times the questions come in relation to the uses. So I like to really try to explain, you know, of the 6 uses, and are they appropriate? Are they compatible? And if they are, then we can allow them. And so that's probably one of the more general ones that we've gotten in the past. So
We just got our first question.
okay.
And it's Joan, and she would like to know, where does the salt come from? Is it part of a former inland sea? And they said it was a great presentation. And I know that we're going to be talking about water on Friday, or Saturday, so you should better listen to that one too. But you can certainly, yeah.
You bet. I'll hint to it just a little bit. I'll leave the details for the other presentation, but my understanding, it basically was an inland sea at one time. And so I talked about the mineral intrusion zone that basically underlies the refuge. And so as you go out from the refuge, let's say as much as 10 or 15 miles out, that the geology under the refuge basically turns to more sand and not so much of the calcium and stuff. And so for whatever reason, the makeup of this area, and if you go further to the east, you've got the town of Hutchinson, and it's got a huge salt mine underneath it. So it's basically the geology and that mineralization that underlies the refuge that really brings the salts up. And so with such a high water table, and then all those minerals, whenever you get drying of the water, whenever the waters come to the surface and then evaporate, it leaves those salts on the surface. So, but my understanding, it was an inland sea at one time. So,
well, I know Rex is going to talk a lot more about that, the geology on
indeed,
Saturday at 2.
Yep.
Right. Okay, we have another question. It says, where did the whooping cranes go from there in fall? And that's going to be discussed by a whooping crane specialist too. So, but you can.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I'll give just a little bit of a hint. Basically, when they leave us, some of the other stops on the way, there's Salt Plains National Wildlife Refuge down in Oklahoma, and then further south into Texas, Buffalo Lake National Wildlife Refuge, a little ways out of Amarillo, Texas, and then they continue to move down and eventually end up down at Aransas National Wildlife Refuge or in that general vicinity. So,
and that's one of our speakers on Saturday as well, Liz Smith, who works there. And I know last year she was thrilled because she saw 2 whooping cranes that had been tagged, and when she got to Texas, they came to her, she saw them again, the same ones. So that was pretty nice. Yeah. And then we have a question here that says, a great talk. Are there walking or hiking trails at Quivira?
There are in fact 2 hiking trails, one that's right outside of the visitor center itself. So if you were to go out there, it's Birdhouse Boulevard. That's a very, very small trail, but then it also links up to basically a grassy trail that goes further west and then down to Little Salt Marsh. And so that's one of the less used trails on the refuge. But if I were you, I would really look up a trail we have that's called Migrants Mile. That's in about the middle of the refuge. And so you want to go to that one. We do have a small wetland in the middle of that. It holds a few birds. September time period when the pollinators are coming through, all the butterflies, dragonflies, and monarch butterflies. That's a spectacular place to go. And a lot of birders go there just to see warblers and other species. So Migrants Mile Trail is a good one.
You might mention too that I know that the visitor center is not open right now, obviously, but you do have an inner place there with kinds of brochures and things. And I would imagine there's a map there that kind of explains some of that too if people go, right?
Yep. Yeah, so correct. We've got at the front of the visitor center, we've got a little brochure box, and we've got general brochure, and we've got a bird list brochure, and also a hunting and fishing brochure. And so that's at the front of the headquarters, even though we're not open right now. But we've also got 7 or 8 kiosks staggered across the refuge. And we have the same information at each one of those kiosks if you can find your way there. So you don't have to go right to the visitor center just to see or to gather that information. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. Another one is, do you, again, they say, thank you for your presentation. They liked it. And this is, what steps are being taken during hunting season to protect the whooping cranes?
So probably the major one that we have that's always been as part of Quivira, because we're the refuge is critical habitat for the whooping crane. When they start coming through, we shut down the refuge to hunting until they all migrate through. So I think about 3.5 weeks ago, we started seeing some of the first whooping cranes coming through. At the time I gave this program, and we had about 8 that we had seen. I think probably now we're at between 30 and 40 individuals that have come through. And so as of about almost 2 weeks ago, we shut down, and we won't open up again to hunting until the majority of the population has already gone through. And we've seen most of those cranes already go through into Oklahoma and are down at Aransas. And so we usually like to wait for the last cranes to come through, then give it a few extra days. And then once they've all gone through, then we can probably consider it safe enough to open up.
Good. Another question here is, how many endangered species are there on the refuge, and do their needs conflict with each other?
Not really on Quivira. There probably are on other refuges. So we've got the whooping crane, we've got basically the interior least tern, and then just recently, I believe we've got the black rail. And I believe it's no longer considered. I believe it is endangered. And so with those, they're all pretty much wetland specific species. And so we don't have anything as it comes down to the relationship of like a grizzly bear and salmon or something like that. And so everything as far as that goes pretty much gets along with most of what we got going on. So.
And another question somebody asked was, who owned the land before 1955, before it became a refuge?
So multiple landowners. And so if you look at any refuge out there, and specifically Quivira, Fish and Wildlife usually starts with a parcel of land, and then they expand from there. And at the beginning of the time when it became, or at least they established it as a refuge, it was not 22,135, it was much smaller. So they started with that smaller piece of land, and as time goes on and as they buy more land up from willing landowners, it eventually expands. And so some refuges don't get fully bought out for 10, 15, 20, or even 30 years. And so some of the refuges I've worked on in my last probably 29 years, one of them was, halfway to becoming a refuge, and the rest was about half private landowners. So there were multiple landowners that owned it before the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Well, I don't have any other questions at the moment, but those were all
Okay.
good questions. Yeah,
Good.
and you answered them really well. Yeah, I'm hoping people can, even though we couldn't do our tours there, I'm hoping people can go there on their own with their own family members or somebody that's safe to go with, or even by themselves, and take advantage of this time of year, because it's cranes, it's thousands of sandhill cranes, it's all these other migratory birds that are just phenomenal right now too, besides the whooping cranes. So if and if the weather's nice, you should really take advantage of it.
Yeah.
It is a ways for some of us to drive, but it's still, it's still an amazing place. So I would hope people can.
Yeah.
So,
And I would offer up, I mean, it's been really great this last week, and great weather. And I think some of the bird numbers we've seen this last week alone, and not just whooping cranes, but we've had about 120,000 geese, and 20 to 30,000 cranes, and then so many duck species. I mean, the bird numbers are really big on the refuge right now. And I guess everybody just needs to realize when you go out there, and be patient, because a lot of folks are trying to get on the refuge right now. They're all trying to stack up on Wildlife Drive and try to get to the best location to view the birds. And a lot of folks we found over the last couple of days are actually trying to even walk out there to where the birds are. And we just ask for everybody to stay in your vehicle and use your vehicle as a blind, and be patient and stuff like that. But we try to keep disturbance of the birds to a minimum. And so don't walk into the field, and don't approach the birds, and don't try to get the best photograph because the birds are way out there. Just kind of enjoy what you have, because we found that if one person walks out there, then 10 people want to walk out there, and we're pretty soon we're starting to disturb everything. So
yeah,
just respect what we have out there, and it's a beautiful sight. I mean, it's deafening to hear the birds that we have out there, Big Salt Marsh and Little Salt Marsh. It's an awesome spectacle. So
yes, it is. It's an awesome spectacle. Well, I'm going to put your information back up on the screen for a while, and but I thank you so much for your presentation and everything, Mike. That was just really wonderful, and it doesn't look like we're getting any more questions, so
okay,
I think we're about ready to wrap it up. So yeah, I'm going to put this back up here, so people can, if they want to write any of that information down, they can. And otherwise, I think you can say goodnight.
Sounds good, Cynthia. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good night, and hopefully you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to leave this up a little while, and people can write down any of that information. And again, if you want to send another email, you can send it to that email address there, and he will answer any more questions you might have, because I definitely can't answer them. But and this has been really nice, and I really appreciate everybody joining us. Thank you.